Imagine that the last sliver of sunlight has just vanished behind the endless white horizon, leaving nothing in its wake but a heavy silence and a night that won't end for more than 16 hours. In a place where temperatures plummet to 50 degrees below zero, darkness becomes more than just the absence of light. It becomes something you feel watching you, waiting for the slightest mistake you might make. And now, let me ask you a question that might seem simple, but it meant the difference between life and death out there. What if the fire died out while you were sleeping? No one will wake you. No alarm will warn you that the warmth has started to slip away from the cabin. With every passing minute, the air around you turns into a silent enemy, creeping in slowly, even before you realize your body has begun to lose its battle. Today, we might think of sleep as the most comforting part of our day, but in ancient Siberia, sleep was the most dangerous decision a person made every night. Because you close your eyes while a freezing death stands right behind a wooden wall only a few logs thick, waiting for the fire to weaken, or for eyes to drift shut, or for a storm to hit fiercer than usual. In truth, just thinking about it is enough to make our warm night tonight feel like an indescribable blessing. What's even more astonishing is that the people of that land didn't face this fate just once. They lived it every single night, winter after winter, year after year, until fear became a part of their nightly routine, and warmth became a wealth measured not by what they possessed, but by what they could hold on to until the break of dawn. That is why, if you find yourself at the end of this journey looking at your fireplace or your home or even the warmth of your blanket a little differently, know that you have become one of those who see history through a different lens. And these are the journeys we craft here in the Obscure Dossier, where we don't just narrate the past, we strive to make you live it. And now, shut out the noise of this world for a while, and let us begin the night where just surviving was a victory. As the sun approached the edge of the horizon, something shifted in Siberia. People didn't watch the sunset the way we do today. It wasn't a beautiful scene painting the sky. It was the beginning of a silent countdown, and every minute lost after that moment could make the coming night harsher than the human body could endure. It is easy for us to forget that. When darkness falls for us, we press a small button and the house is filled with light and warmth. But out there, no one had the luxury of delay, and there was no button that could hold back the night even for a single minute. The sun was the only clock they trusted, and when it began to fade, everyone knew that it was time to move. In those fleeting hours, the quiet cabin transforms into a restless hive of activity. The men and sons head out to fetch the last possible loads of firewood, not because they want to build a bigger fire, but because they know that in just a few hours, every single piece of wood could be the reason an entire family stays alive. This might sound like an exaggeration at first, but in reality, it wasn't. In that environment, firewood was hoarded just like food, and sometimes its value was no less. And inside, hands knew no rest either. Women and elders would carefully inspect the wooden walls, an eye here, a hand there, searching for the tiniest crack between the logs, because the freezing air doesn't need a large opening. A narrow, barely visible gap is enough. Then it begins to creep in with a strange patience, as if it knows that victory doesn't come by force, but by persistence. That is why dried moss, plant fibers, and in some areas mud, turned into actual armor, packed between the timbers with immense care, not to decorate the cabin, but to seal every vent that might allow Siberia's bitter cold to find its way inside. It is truly astonishing that the battle for survival was sometimes decided by a gap no wider than a few centimeters. As time passes, the light outside the cabin slowly begins to fade, and the movement becomes faster than before. Not out of panic, but out of experience. These people didn't wait for the storm to hit before they acted. They learned through long generations that preparation begins before a person even feels the danger. And perhaps here lies one of nature's greatest lessons, for it rarely grants a second chance to those who are late. And before the last light disappeared from the sky, the doors were sealed shut and checked one last time. The small windows were carefully secured, and everything inside the cabin took on a single purpose, preserving as much warmth as possible, because the heat lost now wouldn't be easily regained hours later when the night swallows everything outside. In those moments, if you stood silently from in front of one of those wooden cabins, you would hear nothing but the wind growing fiercer by the minute, as if testing the endurance of those inside. While behind those walls, no one was waiting for sleep just yet. Everyone was bracing for the first real test, a test that would last until the break of dawn, where there was absolutely no room for error, not even once. After the wooden door is shut and the last trace of light fades outside, all eyes inside the cabin turn to one place, the stove, or as it was known in ancient Russia, the pechka. At first glance, it might seem like a mere structure of clay and brick where firewood is burned, but the truth was entirely different. On those nights, the stove wasn't just a piece of furniture. The entire house revolved around it. Everything began with it, and the family's life anchored upon it. Here, food was cooked, wet clothes were dried, and here the family gathered to face the cruelty of winter. And even when it was time to sleep, no one strayed far from it, because every extra step away meant stepping closer to the cold, and in Siberia, the cold never forgave distance. For this reason, many of those stoves were designed massive enough to feature a raised platform on top or right beside them, where the rising heat gathered quietly. This spot was the most precious place inside the cabin, not because it was the most comfortable, but because it was the safest. It was usually reserved for the young children, the elderly, or those exhausted by illness. As for the strong, they made way for them, because everyone understood that assigning sleeping spots wasn't a matter of comfort, it was a matter of survival. And the more you reflect on this scene, you realize that the fire there wasn't just a burning flame, it was the true lifeline, a tiny fragment of warmth standing alone against an entire ocean of ice. Perhaps this is why the divine words ask, "Have you considered the fire which you ignite?" In places like this, a human being grasps the meaning of this blessing in a way that is hard for us to imagine. For the fire didn't just give them light, it gave them a new chance to witness another sunrise. It is one of the greatest blessings bestowed upon mankind, its true value only fully revealed when everything else fades away. But preserving this blessing was a responsibility that didn't end with merely lighting the wood. Rather, it began immediately after. Embers don't stay alive forever, and if left unattended, their heat slowly fades away until they turn into cold ash. That is why the fire was treated as a living creature that needed care, fed at the right time, watched over with patience, and never let to die out unnoticed. In fact, some families would assign this task to a specific person during the night, waking up every now and then, looking at the glowing embers, adding a piece or two of wood, and then quietly returning to their place. This might sound simple to us, but it never was, because those few minutes might have been the deciding factor between a cabin staying warm until morning and one where the cold silently begins to creep in. Imagine this scene for a moment. Everyone is fast asleep. The cabin is completely still. Nothing is heard but the crackling of burning wood. Then that sound gradually fades and the embers begin to lose their red glow. In that very moment, the danger doesn't feel terrifying because it attacks, but because it makes absolutely no sound. It sneaks in so slowly that you can barely feel it. And perhaps that was the most terrifying thing about the Siberian cold. It doesn't knock on the door, it just waits for the fire to weaken and then walks in on its own. And so, guarding the stove wasn't just a daily chore, it was akin to guarding souls themselves. Everyone sleeping near that small flame knew deep down that keeping it burning until dawn wasn't a luxury, it was another promise of life, a promise no one dared to break. And although the fire gave them warmth, it wasn't capable of heating every corner of the cabin equally. And here begins another phase in the battle for survival, a phase that doesn't rely on firewood alone, but on the human being itself, and on the way they use their body heat in the smartest possible way. In our world today, sleep might seem like a private space. Everyone has their own bed, maybe their own room, a space shared with no one else. But in ancient Siberia, this idea melted away completely with the very first harsh winter night. Privacy was a luxury, but survival was the only priority. When it was time to sleep, family members didn't lie apart. Instead, they drew as close to one another as possible, shoulder touching shoulder, back supporting back, and the children in the middle, where the temperature was most stable. Then, thick layers of reindeer hides or sheepskin or other animals known for their astonishing ability to trap warm air between their bristles were pulled over everyone. These heavy pelts transformed into something like a massive cocoon, offering not so much comfort, but rather an extra chance to survive until morning. If we look at this scene through a modern lens, it might seem suffocating and perhaps utterly uncomfortable. But what's astonishing is that the very concept of comfort was different there. The question wasn't, will I sleep comfortably, but rather, will I wake up at all? And when that becomes the real question, all standards change. And they knew through experience, not from books, that the human body doesn't keep its heat to itself. It shares a part of it with whoever is next to it. That is why the closeness of bodies wasn't just an expression of family bonding. It was a calculated method to resist the cold, as if each person was gifting a piece of their warmth to the other, creating an invisible wall between them that the frost found hard to pierce. In fact, some families, especially in the most unforgiving regions, resorted to a solution that might seem strange to us today. They would bring some of the young livestock inside the cabin during the night, like lambs or young goats, not out of pity for them, but to benefit from their body heat as well. One might find this scene bizarre at first, but when the temperature outside is enough to freeze everything, Every source of warmth, no matter how simple, turns into a blessing that cannot be forsaken. Imagine the cabin in that moment, the wooden walls holding back the wind, the stove exhaling its last warm breaths, and the entire family huddled close beneath the furs. Amidst them, the sounds of quiet breathing, and perhaps the faint noise of a small animal that has also settled in a corner of the space. At first glance, the scene looks crowded, but in truth, it represents the greatest form of cooperation nature ever forced upon humanity. Everyone there, human and animal, shares a single goal: to make it through this night with the fewest losses possible. And perhaps here emerges a truth we haven't thought much about. Civilization grants man more space for himself, but harsh nature sometimes teaches him that survival is only achieved when he surrenders a part of that space. In Siberia, sleep wasn't a test of comfort, it was a test of sacrifice. Either you accept this closeness with all its confinement and weight, or you choose a distant corner where the cold awaits you with merciless patience. And on those nights, no one ever risked making that choice.
Then comes the part that was perhaps hardest of that entire night. The part the cold doesn't speak of out loud, but whispers about in the middle of the night, when everyone thinks the battle is over, when in reality it has only just begun. We are used to sleep being a continuous journey. We close our eyes and don't open them again until morning. But in ancient Siberia, this wasn't a luxury many knew. Sleep was broken into short intervals, punctuated by forced awakenings, as if a person was striking a temporary truce with the cold, nothing more. In the darkest hours of the night, someone slowly opens their eyes, not because their body has had enough sleep, but because their instinct tells them it is time to check the fire. They slip away quietly so as not to wake the others, reach out toward the stove, and search with their eyes for that faint red glow among the ashes. If they find it, they breathe a little. But if they don't, anxiety might set in even before they begin lighting the wood. And I believe the most terrifying thing here isn't just waking up, but the reason they woke up. Imagine waking up every night, not to get a drink of water, nor to check the time, but because you know that a few minutes of negligence could let the cold win before the break of dawn. This alone is enough to make sleep itself feel like a heavy responsibility, not a rest one looks forward to. In those moments, the cabin becomes so still it is almost frightening. Nothing is heard but the scrape of one piece of wood against another, or the crackle of a tiny ember catching its breath. Then silence returns once again. But it isn't a reassuring silence. It is a silence that makes any sound coming from outside seem closer than it really is. Suddenly, the stillness is pierced by a long howl echoing through the trees, the howl of a wolf searching for prey, or perhaps for an opportunity. It is hard for us today to know just how close those wolves came to the cabins, but what we know for certain is that their voices were a familiar part of Siberian nights, and that hearing them in this darkness was enough to awaken the fear buried deep within anyone. Then the wind blows once more, not as a passing breeze, but as a force violently slamming against the wooden walls. The wood lets out a faint groan, as if it too is resisting. Sometimes the sound of snow scraping against the roof creeps in, and sometimes the storm feels as though the cabin is trying to uproot it entirely. And for a brief moment, those inside might imagine that the walls won't hold much longer. Then the minutes pass, and the cabin remains standing, as if it too has grown used to fighting this battle every single night. But perhaps the hardest part of it all is that the darkness doesn't allow the mind to see the full truth. When you cannot see what surrounds you, imagination begins to fill in the missing pieces of the picture. Every sound becomes a possibility, every movement behind the wall a mystery, and every gust of wind might sound like approaching footsteps. This is the nature of the human psyche. It doesn't always fear what it sees, but what it cannot see. That is why the battle during those hours wasn't just against the cold, it was against the mind as well, against that heavy feeling that the world outside the cabin has completely vanished, and that between you and that vast wilderness is nothing but a wooden wall and a fire trying not to die out. Then, after the wood is added once more, and the flame returns to paint its shadows on the walls, everyone silently returns to their places, as if nothing happened. But the truth is, another Siberian night had just wrestled another round from them, before granting them a few more hours of sleep.
And finally, after long hours where the night seemed as though it would never end, the change everyone patiently waited for happens. Not all at once, but so slowly that you can barely notice it at first. The darkness lightens a little. Then a pale gray ribbon appears at the horizon, as if the sky itself is starting to catch its breath after a long night of struggle. In that moment, no one rushes outside in joy, and no one celebrates the end of the night. Instead, a quiet feeling washes over the cabin that is hard to describe, a feeling known only to those who spent the night waiting for this light. For them, the first thread of dawn wasn't just the beginning of a new day, it was a silent message saying, "You survived once again." The first to wake begins to approach the stove, making sure the embers still hold their heat, then adds a little firewood, and soon the fire is dancing inside the cabin once more, as if it too has successfully made it through the night. And then everyone gradually begins to move. The door is opened cautiously, freezing air rushes in for a moment, and eyes stretch toward the outside. Out there, Siberia looks as though it hasn't changed. The forests are still cloaked in snow, the rivers are still asleep beneath layers of ice, and the wind hasn't surrendered its cruelty. But one thing has changed, the human standing before this scene. They have crossed another night, and that alone was enough to give them a feeling that words cannot forge. And I believe that when we look at this scene today, we might understand a different meaning of victory. We often associate it with great wars or massive achievements, but out there, victory simply meant waking up, seeing the light once more, finding your entire family around you, and knowing the fire is still alive. Sometimes the greatest victories are the ones no one sees. And as we reflect on this harsh life, we realize just how much our own lives have changed. Today, it might take no more than the push of a small button for the room to light up, the heater to turn on, and the cold to vanish in minutes.
so much so that we rarely stop to ask ourselves how many blessings surround us in every moment. And perhaps for this reason, reflecting on the lives of those people doesn't just make us marvel at their strength, it makes us look at our own lives differently, with more gratitude and more humility. God has blessed mankind with countless gifts, the blessing of safety, the blessing of shelter, the blessing of warmth. These are blessings that might seem ordinary because they accompany us every day, but in places like ancient Siberia, they meant the difference between life and death. That is why true gratitude isn't born from the abundance of what we own, but from realizing the value of what we have. At the same time, this journey teaches us another equally important lesson. No matter how cruel nature becomes, humans possess an astonishing ability to adapt, an ability God instilled in them since creation. With the mind, patience, and the wisdom passed down through generations, they managed to turn a simple wooden cabin into a sanctuary, turn a tiny spark of fire into an entire life, and turn a night that could have been their end into the beginning of a new day. And perhaps this is why ancient Siberia doesn't remain just a distant place on the map. It becomes a witness to something much deeper, to the fact that humankind, no matter how times change, will always search for the exact same things: a home to shelter them, warmth to protect them, and people to find peace with at the end of every day. And as soon as the sun rises a little higher above the white horizon, the village bursts into life once more, as if the battle of the previous night had never happened. But everyone who lived through it knew deep in their souls that just witnessing this morning was the greatest reward they could ever receive.